What's up everybody, welcome back to the channel and another Outriders video. And we know when we talk about Firepower Technomancer, we are referring to Blighted Rounds Borealis. It is by far the most common setup for it, and it is extremely lethal if stacked with the right mods. But a question that I've often been asked, and also asked myself, is whether something like Plague Sower, which is the other Firepower set for Technomancer, could be as good or maybe potentially even better. And what we're going to look at today is a version of that build which I definitely think is equally strong and in some cases stronger, but has a slightly different way of playing it, and consequently also slightly different advantages and disadvantages depending on what you want to do. Either which way, it's a cool thing, the fact that we don't have to be sort of pigeonholed into having to run Borealis the entire time, and that you are able to use another set to accomplish a similar kind of build, even though a lot of the mods end up being the same. Now, since this is Firepower Technomancer, of course Blighted Rounds is the order of the day, and then of course the fact that you have to keep those rounds up by some way or form, and also trying to stack as many additional damage mods onto them. And this is really where you have a lot of similarities between this build and what we see on Borealis. It plays the same as well, where you kind of like want to be abusing Cold Snap to a degree, but this is where it starts playing into how this build plays a little bit differently. I think when it comes to a pure power comparison, Borealis has more power up front without you actually having to do anything to get that additional 50% damage to frozen. Basically something just has to be frozen and you're good to go. Whereas with Plague Sower it works a little bit different, and you actually have to have multiple targets infected with toxic, which will then actually give you more damage and get you to the 50% that you can also get from Plague Sower. Now, interestingly enough though, if you suffer with any kind of survivability issues with Blighted Rounds Borealis edition, then you'll actually find yourself not struggling when you roll Plague Sower, because Plague Sower also has that additional damage reduction that was originally what was on the set rolled into this. This means as long as you are using Blighted Rounds to apply toxic to as many things as possible, and then of course through Cold Snap and Lethal Devices abuse, you can also do this, as well as your Blighted turret actually spraying that, poison goo all over the place. You should generally not have a problem with stacking up toxic on enemies and therefore getting your bonus up. Now, where this does suffer a little bit, and this is I would say the fundamental difference between this and Borealis, is, as I've mentioned, if you are facing single targets or you're only able to put toxic onto one or two things, then of course you're gonna have a really hard time, aka impossible time, to actually get to your 50% additional damage. And this is really where Borealis is more effective, because Borealis, regardless on the amount of enemies, as long as you can freeze something, you're gonna get the additional damage. When it comes to the actual build itself, we're going to do the same thing we always do. We're going to look at the weapons first. We're going to talk about the armor and the mods on there. We're going to talk about the skills and the rotation you should be looking at, even though this is a Firepower build, so it's extremely straightforward. We're also going to talk about the class tree, the PAX choices you should be making, and lastly, I'll make some recommendations on what you should be targeting first when it comes from, to an Ascension point situation. Now, please do ignore the transmog. This is, of course, using at least 3 pieces of Plague Sower. I do transmogs just to make it easier for me to remember which builds belong to what. But looking at the weapon first, since this is a Firepower build, and since you want to have Blighted Rounds on and then keep that Blighted Rounds up, you only really need to concern yourself with your primary weapon. In this case, I'm using an Inferno Seed. And specifically, this Inferno Seed comes with Wrath of Moloch, which causes burn and an explosion on enemies when you crit them. This is a Firepower build that's focused on Blighted Rounds, as mentioned, so crits reward you with higher damage. And generally speaking, if you are able to land crits with this build, you're going to see a lot more success versus someone that's not able to land crits. So as you could have seen from my footage there on the boss there, of course, if you have like 85% crit rate, or 87 or something like that, which is kind of like potato, I could definitely do better. Then of course my damage will suffer a little bit, but as long as you hit a certain amount of crits, you should be good to go. Now, I also have Dark Sacrifice on here, which was of course buffed with the latest patch, which has now actually been out for a little while, but that gives us good ramp up on the gun itself as well, with the sacrifice of a little bit of HP. And then I have Ultimate Weakening Bullets on here, which applies weakness every 1 second when I shoot. Now, the reason why I have this on here is because I lean into a little bit of additional damage to weakness, and this was mostly me trying to offset the chance that I might have issues where I only have toxic on 1 or 2 enemies, and so therefore I don't get that full 50% additional damage that comes from Plague Sower, and so I need to go look for that damage elsewhere. Now when it comes to the armor itself, we start right off with the Plague Sower skull, and let's talk about the set bonus immediately straight off the rip. This says upon applying toxic status, you gain 5% damage reduction and 10% firepower bonus for 10 seconds. Now this can stack up to 5 times, which means you can go up to 25% damage reduction, which is really, really good, and you can get up to 50% firepower bonus for 10 seconds. Now on here, of course, what you're looking for is you're looking for as much firepower as you can get on your gear, and then consequently you're also looking for status power, which is really good, and long range damage, which is really good. And then a little bit of cooldown reduction can also help, because having access to more cold snaps means more application of toxic and frozen, which means locking down the enemies, which means an easier time of hitting crits. On here we have To the Bone, which is a great mod for blighted rounds, which basically says that as long as you have blighted rounds up, your anomaly damage is increased by 15%, which is a huge damage, sort of on top. Don't confuse this with anomaly power, which is basically an amount that denotes how much anomaly damage you can deal, whereas anomaly damage is a flat increase to all of your anomaly damage sources. We have Radical Therapy on here, which gives us additional damage to Toxic, which is good, as well as Euthanizer, same reason. We will be applying Toxic to everything when we shoot it with blighted rounds, and so therefore we want to be dealing as much additional damage to Toxic as we can. Our second piece of play, no wait, I lie. We then go to the Robe of the Borealis Monarch for our chase piece, just simply because that gives us access to more bonus firepower, some status power, some long range damage, fantastic substats there, but also Icicle Storm. Icicle Storm is kind of like a super necessary mod when it comes to playing Firepower Technomancer, due to the fact that you are focusing on shooting single targets, and even though shooting blighted rounds, it kind of spreads that toxic around close to everything that you're shooting at, and that's just by base how that skill works, which is another thing that really suits this build, because it spreads the toxic around, which gives you more damage and damage reduction. The point is that you are going to be focused on single shooting things. So if you have a large cluster of enemies, a very fast way to get rid of them is to cold snap the whole bunch, shoot on the side, the cascade effect fires through, and everything dies from the Icicle Storm explosion. Just really good shit. Dumb Bullets is on here because we are using assault weapons, so we want to be doing additional assault weapon damage, which is great. And then of course, any additional help we can get against bosses, champions, and elites are going to be good for us, and that's why we need Captain Hunter on here. There really is no reason for you to ever not run Captain Hunter on any single build that you ever use, and that's simply due to the fact that no build under the sun has a problem with dealing with trash, but most builds will come up against bosses, elites, and champions and have to spend some time killing them, and anything you can do to make them take less shots, less abilities, less spells, less everything is better for you. Now, then we go over to our second piece of Plague Sower on the pants, and that's going to give us Alchemical Mastery in our first slot there, which is Blighted Rounds. A Blighted Rounds mod that says while the skill is active, you get either more weapon damage or anomaly power based on 15% of your status power, whichever is higher. We are stacking firepower, so it's going to increase our firepower, or rather our weapon damage. But very specifically here, this is the other reason why we're trying to grab as much status power as we can, because that's also going to end up giving us a little bit more stats here. Spare mag is on here because I wanted to, in a way, boss proof this build so that I didn't have to do any gear switching with this build. So what I mean by that is that, for instance, when I built the Borealis version of Technomancer, of Firepower Blighted Rounds Technomancer, I included a separate boot that you had to sort of like switch around to be able to deal with the fact that you're not dealing enough damage to kill the final boss like the Arbiter in one clip. So with this addition here, and with the footage that you saw at the beginning of this video, you could see that I don't do any gear switching, and that I essentially just use this for whether I'm just running expeditions or whether I'm killing bosses. I don't do any gear switching. The only thing I do is I swap what is it called, Cold Snap for Cryo Turret, but I'll explain that when we get to the skills. But that's really the only difference between the two, whether you're running expos and killing trash, and whether you're doing, group play with your buddies, and whether you're doing trials and all of that. I keep the same gear because, I'm lazy by default. I don't want to switch the shit, so it just makes more sense for me. So that's why spare mag is on here. Spare mag gives us an additional blighted rounds full mag, and with all of the mods and everything that we have on here, as well as the changes, you know, or the things that we have in the class tree, as well as the ascension points, we have close to 54 bullets in one mag. So this gives us over 100 bullets, and that's more than enough to actually kill a boss. Then we also have shatter on here because we are applying cold snap to things. Even if you're using crowd tart, that's freezing things, and so therefore you deal the additional damage to things that are frozen. And then we have the plague sower's hands on here, which gives us our third piece of plague sower. This has virulent compound on it, which is a mini version of Captain Hunter. More damage against elites is always good. This is 10% against things that are toxic or blight fire. You apply toxic the entire time, so that's fantastic. We have trick up the sleeve here, which is our reload mechanism. So even though we have spare mag, that spare mag is there for boss fight situation. Generally speaking, keep that first mag up, and so therefore this rewards you with 30% extra bullets returned to your mag for every enemy that you kill while blighted rounds is up. Here we also have Trample the Weak, which says deal 12% more damage against enemies afflicted by weakness. Now our weapon here applies weakness to enemies that we shoot every 1 second, so this is another way for us to tap into a little bit of additional damage there. And lastly, on the boots here, I have Boots of the Borealis Monarch here with Sharp Eye on them, which is great, which rewards you for hitting those crit shots by increasing your firepower, which can stack up to 3 times. We have Kingslayer on here, which again capitalizes on critical shots, which is really good. And last but not least, we have the Cycle, which actually increases your weapon damage by a percentage, and this percentage is equivalent or proportional to your health regeneration. Now, health regeneration is something that by default we get from our PAX tree, and so that's actually just going to give us like a flat 4%, you know, increase, maybe a little bit more, but yes. So then when we get over to the skills tree, or the skills that we're actually using, as mentioned, if you are running everything except a boss, you are running cold snap, blighted turret, and blighted rounds. That's your cold snap is on a super nice cooldown of 10 seconds. That's really cool. That means every 10 seconds you can cold snap. Fantastic. Your blighted turret is on a very low cooldown of 3.5 seconds, which means every 3.5 seconds you can throw that out, and through adrenalizing antenna, that actually gives you a little bit more weapon damage, which is fantastic. And then of course, the main way we deal damage with this build is blighted rounds. Now, once you fight a boss, the only thing you do, you don't have to switch any gear, you don't have to do anything stupid. All you do is you just swap crowd charge for cold snap, and you're good to go. So when we get over to the class tree, of course, I'm going to disappear myself here quickly. And then we do want to be going top tree because we want access to the delicious additional weapon damage that we get up here. So we do want to be picking up all along the way. This is built basically exactly the way you build Borealis Technomancer. So if you're familiar with that setup, there's really nothing new going on here, but you are going to be picking up additional weapon damage here. You're going to dip down here, you're going to get yourself exposing toxin, which says that every time toxic is applied to an enemy, vulnerable is applied as well, and that's actually going to be increased by marked for execution. We absolutely grab 2 nitrogen capsules here, which decreases the distance from which stuff is considered long distance. So it goes from 18 meter all the way down to 12 meter, which means that now you can be closer to things and still get that additional long range damage that you're stacking. We do get additional damage here to toxin. We get blur screen here because this increases our health regen threshold, and kind of like blur screen, this point here, you can end up throwing that wherever you feel like putting it, but it's kind of a habit that I've gotten into whenever I play with Dark Sacrifice, that I take this because it kind of just helps me, or you know, offset a little bit of that additional, you know, or that damage that comes from Dark Sacrifice, even though Dark Sacrifice's damage is nothing hectic anymore, since it was, you know, sort of like I would say nerfed and then kind of like fixed in a way with the latest patch. Then we absolutely pick up Assault Master because we are using an assault weapon, so why would we not want that additional damage? We keep going down here. We get 2 sides of the power. It should have just been 2 sides of power. I don't know. 2 sides of the power here, which says increase damage received from all sources by 10%, but also deal more. So it's kind of like a glass cannon thing. You take more damage, but you also push out more. We absolutely get ourselves UT14 clips, which is another reason why we have more bullets in our mag. We get ourselves Purge, and then last but not least, Empower. I said Adrenalizing Antenna. I apologized. I said Adrenalizing Antenna before, but I meant Empowering Antenna, which means that every time when you throw out your blighted turret, then you're going to be getting this 30% additional weapon damage for 8 seconds. And your blighted turret is on such a low cooldown that you'll basically just be throwing this out the entire time. Now, when we get over to the PAX tree itself, of course, we are going top PAX here, because that is the way how you go when you build firepower with blighted rounds. But we're picking up initial striker, which gives us more firepower every time we activate a skill, because that is our predominant stat. We get lethal devices because we want all of our ordnance and gadget skills to inflict toxic on things when they get hit by those effects. So that means if you have a cryo turret and it shoots something and applies freeze, it also applies toxic. That means if you throw down a cold snap and it puts that frozen wave out, that also applies toxic. And that means that that's going to empower up your damage mitigation on your armor due to Plague Sower. It's also going to increase your additional damage and get you to that 50%. And you're going to be able to deal more damage against things that are toxic, because you're also stacking those effects on your mods. We get Painkiller here, which says damaging an enemy grants you 2% health regeneration for 3 seconds. This stacks up to 2 times. And this is how we increase that additional weapon damage with, what is it called? The cycle that comes on there. I actually have to look at the page here now and remember the mod's name. And then we have permanence and we have dissection, and this is the primary way in which we ramp up additional damage to enemies when we put all these status onto them. So this says that inflicting toxic on an enemy has a 100% chance to inflict a random additional status. You'll often see in your gunfights with enemies, you'll see this guy will get, get bleed on him, this guy will suddenly get slowed, this guy will get frozen. Like, all of them will have random different stats applied to them as you shoot them with blighted rounds and they get toxic on them. And then last but not least, dissection says that you deal 5% more damage to enemies for every status inflicted on them. So if you're able to put 4 statuses onto a single enemy, that's going to mean 20% additional damage on top to that particular enemy. Then when we get to the Ascension Points, and I think we can bring my face back, we are going to be focusing on brutality, but our first 10 points are of course going to go into anomaly damage over here for a flat increase over the top. Then definitely you want to be picking up yourself some weapon damage, some long range damage, some close range damage, and I just pick up resistance pierce and armor pierce because that's a little bit of additional damage there. But definitely grab yourself cooldown reduction so you can get those fast snappy cold snaps, and get yourself the additional magazine size. Now if you struggle with survivability, you absolutely should be picking up additional HP, additional armor, maybe even some healing received here, but definitely additional HP and armor if that is something that struggles. Although the Plague Sower set is going to be doing some lifting for you there, some heavy lifting for you there, with the 25% damage mitigation or reduction basically that you get once you have 5 stacks, once you have 5 enemies that are affected by toxic. And that's going to be it for the video as well as the build. Thank you so much for watching, especially if you made it this far. Let me know in the comments down below if this has convinced you enough to step away from Borealis as the only set to build firepower blighted rounds with on the Technomancer, and if you're willing to give it a try. If you have tried it, am I slow to the dance here? Have you guys already used Plague Sower a lot? Are you impressed by the results? And last but surely not least, which mods would you swap around? What would you introduce additionally into it, and what would you potentially take away to increase the damage profile? Also, this kind of like brings me to, I don't have a whole bunch of other Technomancer builds that I'll be bringing out. I think I've covered like a whole shitload of them, so I'll be focusing on some of the other characters now. But do let me know if there's any other specific, niche Technomancer builds that you'd like me to have a look at and that I could potentially revisit. That's it from me. Thanks again. It's just super important to me that you have a fantastic morning, afternoon, and evening wherever you are in the world. And until next video, fucking cheers.
They want the best of me now, best of me now, best of me now, best of me. They want the best of me now, best of me now, best of me now, best of me.